Between the years 2000 and 2012, there have only been 2,068 cases of voter fraud in the U.S., and of these, 10 were convicted due to voter impersonation. This is according to a study done by the News 21 Journalism Project at the Arizona State University in 2012. The study involved sending public records requests to all 50 state attorney generals and to the district attorneys in all 3,145 counties in the U.S., seeking information on voter fraud by county. Voter fraud is virtually non-existent, and the majority of voter fraud that does occur cannot be prevented by showing a photo ID. In my speech today, I will cover many statistics and examples from the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law, and I myself have been following the accusations of voter fraud since they've been being listed in the media as a major source of voter fraud. Today in my speech, I will cover what is voter fraud, how often voter fraud occurs, what are the most common types of voter fraud and misconceptions surrounding them, what is the punishment for someone who commits voter fraud, and who is affected mostly by voter fraud. So we'll start by taking a look at what exactly is voter fraud. And according to Justin Levitt at the Brennan Center for Justice in New York University School of Law, voter fraud occurs when individuals cast ballots despite knowing that they are ineligible to vote. And this is an attempt to sway the election. This means you cast a vote that you know you shouldn't be. Now that we know what voter fraud is, let's take a look at how often it occurs. When I asked the class how often they felt voter fraud occurred, overwhelmingly, 2/3 of you felt it was way more than the actual 2,068 cases in the last 10 years. More amazingly is that 3 of you felt it was at least 155,000 people who have committed voter fraud. During that time period, there were 146 million registered voters. Of those 10 cases of voter impersonation that were convicted, that means that there is 1 case of voter fraud for every 15 million registered voters. During this survey, when I asked if you thought voter ID law would eliminate most of the voter fraud, 10 out of 14 of you said yes, it would, 3 said no, and 1 of you said it's possible. So let's take a look at what type of fraud occurs most. The most common types of voter fraud, according to the News 21 survey, found that absentee ballots were the most common. Most states do not have any laws regarding who can receive an absentee ballot or the reason for an absentee ballot. Ineligible voters make up approximately 12%, which is those that maybe don't know that they should be voting. There are also errors by poll workers. There's a case in Wisconsin, a Cynthia Alicia, who filled out 2 voter registrations, and she was later brought up on charges by the DA for voter fraud. However, what happened is that Alicia had made a mistake on one of her registrations. The poll workers put it aside, but they never shredded it, and then she filled out a second, and that's where the alleged voter fraud came into play. A lot of issues regarding felons have come up, but the problem with felons voting is each state is a little bit different, and not all poll workers know the laws regarding who can vote or when a felon can vote at what point in time. Corrections officers don't always know when felons can vote either. So there's a lot of issues surrounding that. Non-citizens, a very small percentage of non-citizens actually attempt to vote. Again, laws are just not that clear, and poll workers aren't always clear as to whether or not who can vote. Double voting, 25% of people do double vote, which can be based on accusations. There was a nationwide accusation of double voting that was investigated. And what happened was there were 3,000 individuals with the same name and birth dates across the U.S. that matched up exactly. However, there were many clerical errors within that database where things weren't exactly what they had stated. And when you're dealing with such a large group of people, there's going to be more matches than one would think. So there are actually people that do have same names and birth dates across the U.S. Allegations of wrong address are quite often. There will be clerical errors where there will be a number different, so mail is returned, somebody wrote it down wrong. Also, people do live in places, or people do move from places that they had lived at previously, and mail is returned after an election. There's also examples of people saying there's vacant lots and there are no houses there. However, in New Jersey, there was a list of 2,000 houses that were actually listed as vacant. And when they went through the tax rolls and come to find out, there were actually houses on all of those lots that were accused of voter fraud because they were saying they were vacant lots. Multiple people living at the same address is legitimate. You certainly can live at a place with other people. Also happens where people say when kids live on college campuses, there's a lot of accusation that they're using the same address as well as nursing homes. Voter impersonation occurs the very least when it comes to voter fraud. So if someone does make a conscious effort to intentionally commit voter fraud, what happens? Well, punishment by the federal government, 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. And here in the state of Wisconsin, you're going to get 3.5 years in prison as well as a $10,000 fine. So why would anybody want to commit voter fraud knowing that they have at least $10,000 in fines that they're looking at and 5 years in prison? And they're only going to gain one incremental vote that's not going to sway the outcome of any election. Well, the answer to that is they wouldn't. So let's take a look at exactly who was affected by the voter laws that are aimed at cracking down on the voter fraud. So there are 16 states that have passed voter ID laws, and of those, all have been led by Republican and all have passed overwhelmingly by Republican legislators. 6 of those 16 states that have passed voter ID laws have documented history of discrimination of minority voters. And speaking of minority voters, they are the most affected by these voter ID laws. Even with a free ID, it's a hardship. You need a birth certificate, which is not free. You need to travel to the DMV, and transportation is an issue. So even with this free ID, again, you need to get a birth certificate. Here in Wisconsin, to get a birth certificate, you need to apply either in person or via mail. You have a $20 fee that you need to pay. You need to provide a state-issued driver's license or photo ID. And if you don't have a photo ID, you need to have at least 2 more forms of identification with your signature. You also need to have proof that you're a Wisconsin resident and a social security number. Many of these things are difficult for people to get, and therefore they are not free. Today in my speech, we have discussed that voter fraud is virtually non-existent, and the majority of voter fraud that does occur cannot be prevented by showing a photo ID. We have reviewed what voter fraud is, how often it occurs, who exactly is mostly affected by the voter fraud, and the punishment of such. Voter ID laws have not prevented the type of voter fraud that occurs most commonly in this country. However, what it has done is disenfranchise tens of thousands of voter IDs who are afforded the constitutional right to vote under the United States Constitution.